Thank you, Bryce, and thank you, Lloyd, and the board for the opportunity to be here today and share the Wyoming DEQ's perspective on regional haze and our perspective on EPA's proposed federal implementation plan. Just to start off, just a couple of clarifications, because I'm going to jump into some acronyms. SIP is State Implementation Plan, so I'm going to say SIP, so I don't have to keep saying State Implementation Plan. And then FIP is the Federal Implementation Plan, just so it's clear with it. So to start out with, just a little bit of background on what the Regional Haze Program is. It was established in 1977 amendments to the Clean Air Act, and it was a program established to protect visibility, and that's key. So just remember, visibility is the issue here. So visibility in national parks and wilderness areas. These are also referred to as federal Class 1 areas, with the national goal of making reasonable progress toward prevention of any future and the mitigating of any existing impairment to visibility resulting from man-made pollution, and to achieve this goal by the year 2064. So where is Wyoming with its regional haze program? Well, let me start out by saying there are two different types of SIPs. The first deals with sulfur dioxide, and the other deals with nitrogen oxide and particulate matter. Wyoming's SO2, sulfur dioxide SIP, was originally submitted in 2003. Now, due to a variety of legal issues and so forth that EPA was dealing with, they took no action on EPA's proposal at that time. Due to some changes that occurred as a result of those legal issues, Wyoming resubmitted in 2008. And again, EPA did not take action on that 2008 submittal. Wyoming submitted its third version of a sulfur dioxide state implementation plan, there I said it, SIP, in January of 2011. EPA approved that SIP in January of this year. It's currently under review as Wild Earth Guardians and some others had petitioned it for review. Now, the one that we're here to talk about today is the nitrogen oxide and particulate matter SIP. That also was submitted in January of 2011. Now, EPA's FIP is a partial approval and a partial disapproval. So there are parts of the state implementation plan that were approved or are proposed to be approved by EPA. And those parts that were proposed to be approved were all of the provisions related to particulate matter, and then the nitrogen oxide provisions or portions dealing with non-electric generating units. Now, a key point also is that twice EPA has proposed this FIP. The first FIP was proposed in May of 2012, but under both FIPs, they proposed to approve the particulate matter and the NOx portions for non-electric generating units. The part that they have issued the FIP on relates to the electric generating unit NOx portion of the SIP, and have proposed and re-proposed their FIP in June of 2013. And I'll talk some more about that. Okay, so what is regional haze? What is the Regional Haze Program? Well, as I mentioned, it's a program that addresses visibility in federal Class 1 areas. What isn't it? It is not a health-based program, and it is not a climate change program. There are national ambient air quality standards and rules in place to deal with health-based issues from air quality. There are also rules in place and are currently being developed to deal with climate change. However, you will see in some of the comments related to the regional haze discussion, comments that are made about how EPA's fit will further enhance health benefits to the public. Just very quickly, this is a map that you can pull off of the EPA's website, and it shows the 156 Class 1 federal areas that are protected or targeted under this regional haze program. And just to note, there are 7 in Wyoming. What I want to show you here, and the takeaway from this slide, is that the 3 bars that you see on this graph represent the baseline in decibels for visibility impairment at each of the 3 stations in Wyoming that are used to create the baseline for the 7 Class 1 areas. Now, the takeaway from this is if you look at the different colors on this, on these bars on the histogram, the top 2, the gray and the brown, represent particulate matter, so wind-blown material. The black and the green represent the impact from wildfires. The red is nitrogen oxide, and the yellow is sulfur dioxide. And so the focus of the SIPs is really on the man-made causes of the pollutants that cause visibility impairment, primarily the red and the yellow, the nitrogen oxide and sulfur dioxides. Okay, so what are the concerns that the state has with EPA's FIP? First is states' rights. And this is significant not only for Wyoming, but many other states are dealing with this same issue. And the concern would also be what implications would this have for other programs where the states are the lead authority? So why is it an issue? Well, it's our view that Congress inserted the phrase as determined by the state into the Clean Air Act under this provision to make it clear that states would have the authority to identify and control sources of haze, not EPA. EPA serves a different role under the Regional Haze Program. Now, just point out that this issue is not unique to Wyoming, and it's currently being litigated in response to EPA's multiple disapprovals of state plans. Cost. From this table, you can see the reductions of Wyoming's plan are 63,000 tons of nitrogen oxides per year. EPA's plan is 70,000 tons. So the difference, 7,000 tons per year of nitrogen oxide emissions. However, when you look at the cost differential, and I want to point out that Wyoming's plan is not cheap. Wyoming's plan costs nearly $1 billion in capital costs to the industry. EPA's is $181 million more. But when you look at the benefit of the additional reductions, you have to question whether the cost justifies those reductions. Of note, on the annualized costs over 20 years, and you've probably seen this figure, $1.2 billion in additional costs annualized over 20 years for very little additional reduction and no perceptible change in visibility. And that's the key. Sue and settle. I think it was mentioned already once here this morning. What is sue and settle? In the context of regional haze, sue and settle is where EPA fails to meet their statutory or court-ordered deadline to fulfill some obligation. In the case of regional haze, EPA's failure to take action on a state plan. then organizations can file suit against EPA, and they're entitled to do this, for failure to meet their obligation. And then they enter into a consent decree, and that's where we have some issues. In this case, the litigation has driven EPA's approach to Wyoming's state implementation plan. It establishes arbitrary deadlines. These deadlines have been moved at the convenience of EPA and of the litigants. The state was not made party to this process. We weren't made aware of the litigation until the consent decree was published in the Federal Register. Another big point here is that EPA continues its efforts to conceal its communication with litigants. Now, what I mean by that is that Wyoming, along with 12 other states, have filed a Freedom of Information request with EPA to see the exchange of communication between the litigants and EPA to determine how much influence and what kind of influence these litigants have had on state implementation plans, not just Wyoming, but other states as well. EPA has denied that FOIA request, and we are continuing to pursue that information. Now, we believe that with EPA's, and I'll refer to it as their reproposed FIP, as you recall, their original FIP was in 2012. Wyoming and others commented on the FIP, as well as did the litigants. EPA worked with the litigants, in our view, to extend the deadline of their consent decree to incorporate comments from the litigants, not considering comments from the state. And we find this very problematic and very troublesome. So let me share something that I find interesting and alarming. And this is from the American Legislative Exchange Council. In the years 1997 to 2008, in those 12 years, EPA took 98 actions of disapproval on state actions, issued 2 FIPs, and entered into 30 sue and settle agreements. In the last 4 years, so in a third of the time, EPA has had 95 disapproval of state actions, 19 FIPs, and 48 sue and settle agreements. This is a significant increase in activity that I find concerning. Now, do I put the blame on this situation on those groups that have taken the actions? No, they're entitled to do that. They're entitled to make sure that EPA follows through and does what they're obligated to do under the law. I think the real problem here is that EPA needs to look at how they can streamline their process and meet their obligations. This is a failure of EPA to meet their obligations that they have established on the timelines. And that's something that all the states have been looking very closely at and having conversations with the EPA on how we can get out of this situation. Process and transparency. We identified several procedural defects with EPA's FIP. The least of which is not the fact that the Federal Register on the FIP went out on June 10th, 2013, only 14 days in advance of the public hearing, the only public hearing that was scheduled for this FIP. Now, at the request of the governor, the legislature, the delegation, the DEQ, and others, EPA did agree to 2 additional hearings and extended a very short amount of time for the public comment period. And the reason that they did not extend it to what was requested by the governor was because they had a consent decree that established the deadline. They said they couldn't move. Another issue that we identified was that under a state implementation plan or a FIP, either the state or EPA needs to have consultation in person with the federal land managers for these Class 1 areas. And they need to include in the FIP the conclusions and recommendations of those federal land managers. Well, Wyoming did that in their SIP. EPA failed to do that, at least as far as we can tell, in their FIP. This is to me is the most troubling. Engineering integrity. EPA hired a consultant out of Massachusetts, and that consultant used Google Earth to determine which technology would be most suitable for retrofit on Wyoming's facilities versus Wyoming's approach, which was on-site engineering analysis. I'll let you be the judge of what you think is most appropriate. EPA's sum game. EPA, in our view, is incorrectly summing non-perceptible improvements in Class 1 areas to create an appearance of a perceptible improvement. What I mean by this is that if you look at the Class 1 areas and you model it out, you might have something less than a 0.5 decibel improvement. Now, anything less than 0.5 is imperceptible to the human eye. There's no disagreement between the state or EPA on that fact. So what they will do is they'll look at 4 modeled areas and say, well, 0.2 plus 0.2 plus 0.2 plus 0.2 is 0.8, therefore it's perceptible. Well, we disagree with this type of an approach, and that would be like saying it rained 1 inch in 10 different places, therefore we had 10 inches of rain everywhere. Now, we would like to have that in parts of Wyoming, but that's not the case. So, questionable math. Now, this is a histogram of modeled results that was developed by EPA in their own document. And I think this is important for a couple of reasons. But first, let me point out that this red line across here is the 0.5 decibels. Anything above the line is perceptible to the human eye. Anything below the line is not perceptible, not a perceptible change in visibility. So you will see the green bars are low NOx burners. The purple bars are selective catalytic reduction. If you convert and retrofit these facilities with low NOx burners, you will achieve visible or perceptible changes in visibility. The addition of SCR will not add anything in terms of visibility. Now, the interesting thing about this particular graph or histogram is that EPA's own modeled results actually reflect the state implementation plan results. This is our conclusion, was that low NOx burners is the appropriate retrofit technology. Now, the one exception, the Nobben plan, second from the right, you can see that SCR was clearly the choice, and that was also where the state came out in its state implementation plan. Okay. Now, what this histogram shows is that the blue bars represent Wyoming's BART determination and the resultant nitrogen oxide emission reductions from electric generating units. The green is the non-electric generating units, and then the long-term strategy that's incorporated in the state's implementation plan is the red. So you can see 63,000 tons by the year 2023 is the result. EPA's plan will result in 70,000 tons. But the key piece on this particular diagram is that the reductions in nitrogen oxides have already started to occur under Wyoming's plan and the proactive approach by our industry. Under EPA's plan, short of the state's plan, reductions would not have occurred until 2018. So you can see that reductions are occurring far sooner under the state's plan. Okay, so in summary, Wyoming SIP does significantly improve visibility. And that's an important issue for the state as well. But it does so at a substantially lower cost than EPA's proposed FIP. Wyoming's BART analysis and reasonable progress determinations comply with the Clean Air Act, the Regional Haze Rule, and the BART guidelines, and should be approved in whole. And I just want to put the plug in for the staff. Our staff, like it has been mentioned, have been working on this for decades. And I think they've done a tremendous job, and they should be recognized for that. They did a very commendable job on the state's SIP. EPA's disapproval doesn't have, in our view, the legal and factual support. It disregards the state judicial process, and I will say that it wasn't an easy process for us to get to our BART determinations with the industry. We had many discussions. It was, as I say, discussed, and then we came to some settlement agreements, and industry has been responsive. And so in conclusion, we do not believe that EPA's promulgation process and the FIP is valid, and we'll be very interested to see how they respond to our comments and others before the November 21st consent decree deadline. So with that, I would thank you.
Just a little bit of introduction for PacifiCorp Energy. I'm the Director of Environmental Services for PacifiCorp Energy. We have two sister companies. Pacific Power and Rocky Mountain Power, which most of you are probably familiar with. PacifiCorp Energy provides the electrical generation to the transmission and distribution companies, Rocky Mountain Power. When we talk about regional haze, I echo what Todd said. It's been going on for a long, long time. We've been involved in this program since, I've been involved since 1992 with the program, and PacifiCorp began implementing projects to start reducing emissions as early as 2005 here in Wyoming. When we talk about regional haze, its main focus is on coal-fired generation. There was a specific subset of coal-fired generation which was designated as BART eligible generation. BART stands for Best Available Retrofit Technology. In the original beginnings of the Regional Haze Program, these BART eligible units, which were constructed between 1962 and 1977, were required to put on BART eligible, what was determined to be BART controls by 2013. Let's go to the next slide, Ken.
I don't often have a remote in my hands.
Just push enter.
Which one is it? It's this one. There you go.
All right. When we talk about these BART eligible units for PacifiCorp Energy, within Wyoming alone, we have 10 eligible units. We have a total of 12 generating units in Wyoming. 10 of those are BART eligible units. The only two that are not are two of our smaller units located at our Dave Johnston plant, and they were built in the late 1950s, and so they were not BART eligible units. In addition to these 10 units that we have in Wyoming, we also have 9 BART eligible units located in 4 other states. So you can see that the breadth of the regional haze impacts on PacifiCorp Energy and how this program has been impacting us. One thing we need to realize and understand is that when we talk about Wyoming generation, the regional haze and what we're required to do in Wyoming not only affects our customers in Wyoming, it affects our customers throughout our service territory. And the same is true for our generation resources that are outside of Wyoming. Things that we have to install in Utah also impact our customers in Wyoming because of the way the resources are allocated between the states. This is the most simple slide you'll see related to regional haze. When we talk about regional haze, as Todd pointed out, the goal of regional haze is to meet natural conditions by 2064. And the parameters that they use to describe reasonable progress, we're talking about inverse megameters, deciviews of improvement, the 20 worst days, the 20 best days. To give you some perspective, I simplified that, and what you see on this chart is a chart that takes PacifiCorp's Wyoming NOx emissions from where they were in 2004 to zero by 2064, just as a point of reference. It certainly doesn't reflect what the requirements of the regional haze rule are. In fact, taking emissions to zero may not even improve regional haze. But as a point of perspective, as I talk through how PacifiCorp has been impacted, I wanted to draw this line so that we can use that. Let's go to the next slide. We've been working with the state of Wyoming since the late 1990s and early 2000s to develop a program. When we, as Todd pointed out, the Regional Haze Program addresses sulfur dioxide emissions, nitrogen oxide emissions, and particulate matter emissions. Those are potentially three significant projects that impact the power plants that we have. If you look at 19 coal-fired plants in 5 different states, consider that you may have 3 significant projects on those plants, or not all of those plants. That equates to 50 to 60 significant projects, and under the Regional Haze Program, if PacifiCorp were required to wait until 5 years, until EPA took their final action, that would give us 5 years to implement 50 to 60 major projects, which is physically impossible to do. So as we worked with the state early on, the state developed their implementation plan and a reduction plan. The PacifiCorp was able to start putting on projects earlier than some may have anticipated, and the process extends out beyond the 5-year period. So PacifiCorp's pollution control projects, and we'll talk specifically with respect to the nitrogen oxides emissions. Our program began in 2005, and it will finish up in 2022. So one of the advantages that we've been able to take with participating with the state and the state's program is extending the expenditures of these projects over a longer period of time than what would have been anticipated under a FIP program. This blue line that you see on this chart, that represents the reductions that the state's plan is going to realize. And if you look at it, that starts at 2004 and goes through 2023 or 2025. The majority of those reductions have already occurred. All of the low NOx burners that Todd has talked about for our Wyoming plants have already been installed. So we're not talking about a program that we're anticipating participating in. We're talking about a program that was begun in 2005, and we're probably, as far as expenditures, probably 60% through our expenditures for the program, with the majority of the reductions already occurring. Let's go to the next slide. This orange line on this slide now represents the progress that would have been made if PacifiCorp had waited until EPA finalized their FIP. Under the Regional Haze programs, once EPA finalizes the FIP, PacifiCorp would have 5 years to implement the program and put it on all the controls on it, the facilities within Wyoming. So when you look at that chart, Wyoming has already begun the process. We wouldn't begin the process under the FIP until the final FIP approval, which we expect to occur at the end of this year. Now, in a way, this is giving EPA some credit for reductions that are occurring sooner than later, because we wouldn't have been able to maintain that kind of a schedule if we hadn't already been participating under the state's SIP program. But we gave EPA the benefit of the doubt and allowed them to follow the reduction line that we've already participating in with the state program. So what is the net result of the state SIP program versus the EPA's program as far as reductions of nitrogen oxides emissions? If you look at that section, that's the blue hashed section, what you see is, I think it's about 243,000 tons of nitrogen oxides that will have been removed from the environment between 2005 and 2022. Under the that's 243,000 more tons than is going to be removed than what if we had waited for the EPA's program. Around 2022, the EPA's program becomes will have less reduction, will have more reductions than what the state's program has, and so at that point the EPA's program becomes positive. But it only comes for PacifiCorp alone. It becomes positive by about 5,000 tons per year. It's the only benefit that we see, and that doesn't occur until 2022. So let's summarize what PacifiCorp has done to date. As I mentioned, the program includes SO2, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and particulate matter. Under the state SIP program, and by the way, PacifiCorp, once EPA established the state SIP, PacifiCorp is obligated to comply with that program. And so we've been working under that state program as required by state law to implement the program. But through 2012, we have already spent on SO2 emissions $820 million. Most of that was for the installation of new scrubbers and retrofitting existing scrubbers, so that today, every coal-fired plant that PacifiCorp has that's a BART eligible unit in Wyoming is sulfur dioxide controls on it, and is meeting an emission rate of 0.15 pounds per million BTU or less. We've also installed low NOx burners on every one of those units. That was incurred at a cost of $80 million. Under the state SIP program, PacifiCorp is still required to install selective catalytic reduction at our Jim Bridger unit. Those are 4 units of our, I look at them as our flagship in Wyoming and our system. They're our 4 biggest units. But under the Wyoming SIP, we will be installing selective catalytic reduction on those units in 2015 and 16, and then the remaining 2 units in 2021 and 2022. The installation of those SCRs is an additional $600 million. So that $600 million will be expended between now and 2022. What is the effect of the EPA's FIP proposal? What they're requiring us to do as PacifiCorp is to install post-combustion controls on every one of those units, those BART eligible units. And that's going to cost an additional $300 million, and those expenditures will have to be expended prior to 2018. Let's go to the next slide. So this is just a summary of the benefit of all of these. If we were to sum sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and particulate matter emissions all together and draw a similar graph as what we had just for the nitrogen oxide emissions, this is what you would see. As you can see from this chart, we're well below a glide path that gets PacifiCorp to 0 emissions by 2064. In fact, when you look at the depreciable lives of our units, our first Dave Johnston plant, its depreciable life goes through 2027. When you look at the depreciable lives of those units, you can see that EPA's $300 million only delivers about 6 years of additional benefit that occur between 2022 and 2027. And when we talk about those $300 million, we're only talking about the capital expenditures. We're not talking about the additional operating and maintenance costs to run these units. Let's go to the last slide. Probably the most significant impact of the EPA's proposed FIP program, more significant than the additional $300 million that we'll have to expend, is its impact it's going to have on our small fire coal generation. Some of you may already be aware that the controls that have been required on our Naughton Unit 3 facility have resulted in that unit being converted to natural gas. So beginning, hopefully if EPA approves it, beginning in 2018, the Naughton Unit 3 will no longer be burning coal, but will be burning natural gas. And the reason for that is because the controls that are now required on that unit are more aggressive and more costly than the cost of gas conversion. The impact of the EPA's FIP is that this same result can occur for our Naughton Unit 1 facility, our Naughton Unit 2, and our Dave Johnston Unit 3 facilities, where selective catalytic reduction has now been proposed on those facilities. I got on Amazon.com and found Don't Break the Ice, one of my favorite games. But I think that's the problem. That's one of the dilemmas we have under Regional Haze program, is we really are to that point where knocking out one more block could jeopardize a lot of the coal facilities. And certainly, I don't think EPA has factored in the economic costs of plant closures that their plan may drive us to. Thank you.
I'm Lyle Witham. I'm the environmental manager for Basin Electric Power Cooperative. I'm third in the lineup, so I'm going to try not to repeat some of the things that have already been said. I'll try and improvise a little bit. I've got a lot of slides here. Most of them are pulled from our experts' presentations in Casper on July 26th on Regional Haze. I'm going to save those to the end and go over those really quickly. I'm going to spend a lot of time on the first few slides, and based on what I've heard, I'm going to actually spend a little time just kind of telling you a little bit about Basin Electric and the history behind this law and why it is so important to Wyoming's future and also to the future of the coal resource in Wyoming. Laramie River Station is 1,710 megawatt unit. Its owners are it's a partnership. It's under the Missouri Basin Power Project is what it's called. Basically, it was a coal generation project built, thought up in the 70s when those public power entities that relied upon the Missouri dam system for their initial power when they were first electrified did not have enough energy to supply their needs, and instead of building that power in Minnesota and Nebraska and in other parts, we needed additional power supply for Dakotas and some of our customers we serve a 9-state region. We are a generation and transmission cooperative, and a lot of our public power, which means we provide wholesale power. Our job is we are owned by our members, and our cost of generation is passed on directly to our members. So our members, our job is to produce reliable and affordable electricity, and our members hold us to that. And the reason the Laramie River Station has kind of an interesting history because it was permitted in the late 70s, and I'm getting to the first slide. It was right when the 77 Clean Air Act amendments were being debated, and the 70 Clean Air Act amendments dealt with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for the first time. The federal government stepped in and set one single national ambient standards to protect public health. And they left it, if you look at the language of that act and the initial case law, I'm a lawyer by trade, and I'll talk maybe a little bit about that as I go here. But the original act basically in 70 dealt with health and safety. The 77 amendments had 3 critical areas where they reserved authority to the states because they dealt with areas that did not impact health, and they dealt with questions for determining in areas where you were in compliance with the national ambient air quality standards that established prevention of significant deterioration increments. That's your PSD-backed program. And to determine best available control technology or BACT, the Congress left that to the states to determine. For another two areas, the second area was visibility in national parks. And I think Wyoming is probably the best example of why Congress left that authority to the states, because in the initial bill in the 77 Acts, they gave this authority to consider what controls should protect visibility to the federal land managers, and they changed that in the law, and they said to consider these 5 factors. We think the state should do that because the federal land manager is going to look only to protect that resource. Industry will, of course, be primarily interested in protecting low rates, like I talked about for us, but the state's in a position to balance those two. And what these 5 BART factors are the factors that the states were supposed to consider in establishing those factors. And if you look through the federal implementation plan that EPA issued, they did not go through a 5-factor analysis. They did not do that. And that's kind of, from our perspective, these are the 3 things, because Regional Haze, actually, there were a whole bunch of reasons why it took from 1977 to 2007 to finally get to BART controls. But the 77 Act required a report to Congress in 79, and then the initial regional haze requirements dealt mostly with plume blight, and EPA said, when we don't have the technology now to really determine the rest of those things that shows impacts from other sources, but the 90 Act required then for EPA there was a requirement for regional groups like the Grand Canyon Group to look at regional impacts from all sources and come up with recommendations to EPA on how to further implement regional haze. Those regulations didn't come out till '99, and then there was litigation that delayed the implementation. But our original plans, the numbers that Director Parfitt used for his numbers were numbers we put together in 2005, 2006. And our plans were due to be submitted to the state by 2006. The state was supposed to make this determination by 2007, and EPA was supposed to have 1 year to make its determination, either to approve or disapprove the FIP. But partly because of litigation, it did not happen that way. Actually, it was the main reason that it didn't happen is that the initial regulations that EPA promulgated did not allow for a source-by-source weighing of the 5 BART factors. Under EPA's the FIP that came out, as Director Parfitt said, EPA originally came out and approved almost all of the state implementation plan with very minor changes in June of 2012, and then supposedly based on comments, they reconsidered, but their reconsideration actually involved hiring a company out of called Andover, as Director Parfitt said. I forget which state are they from again? Massachusetts. That really recalculated in a separate cost factor. And then they remodeled the modeling that the state did. Well, on all 3 of those factors, on the visibility, they used an outdated, inaccurate model. On the cost, they failure to consider the site-specific factors and failure to follow its own rules and cost manual. And on the law, they stepped into the role that the state has been assigned. I'm going to talk briefly about each of those three factors, and then I'll let Cathy talk, and then we can maybe talk about some of the other issues in question and answer. But on the modeling issues, they used an outdated model. The chemistry was wrong. The model over predicts based on a whole bunch of flaws in the model. And when you look at the actual days when you have nitrate impacts on the Class 1 areas that our facility was modeled to look at, those high impact days are not being impacted by Laramie River Station. The data also shows that the primary impact on visibility in Class 1 areas are from wildfires. To what extent are wildfires man-made pollution? To what extent are they natural? That's a really difficult question, but certainly part of the wildfire problem is forest management and land use management, which is a man-made problem. And LRS, the NOx reductions, that their additional NOx reductions from putting SCR really wouldn't make any difference if you model the impacts, which Director Parfitt's slide showed. The model itself was that they relied on was developed in 1983. It uses an overly simplistic chemistry that doesn't really work in temperatures below 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, in the upper Great Plains and in Wyoming, we have a lot of days under 50 degrees where the model is going to give you inaccurate results. And it neglects some major variables and processes that need to be considered if the modeling is going to be accurate. It greatly overstates both the sulfate and the nitrate concentrations in the winter, and it understates SO2 in the summer, but very much overstates the nitrate issue, and this is a NOx or nitrate FIP. And even in EPA's final regulations that were promulgated in 2005, they recognized and they said there are really problems with this model, and they were going to allow states some discretion on how to deal with that, which they, in the end, they haven't done it. Here is some, this is a monitor composition plot for Wind Cave National Park in the Black Hills, which is one of the two Class 1 areas that are primarily, the two that were identified as possibly, potentially being impacted by Laramie River Station. And as you can see, for 2008, the biggest impacts were from wildfires in the summer. That was that green bar there, and the red bars are nitrate model, are actual measured nitrate impacts. And as you can see, there are some impacts in the wintertime because that's when, because of moisture in the atmosphere and temperature, nitrate formation, ammonium nitrate actually forms to impact visibility. In the summertime, there is virtually no nitrate impacts at this particular Class 1 area, and that's true, I think, of most Class 1 areas in the West. Second, same slide from 2009, and same distribution pattern. Here's 2010, and if you look back at 2009, look at the scale. Always look at the scale on a slide, and the microgram and deciview impacts. As you see, for 2008, it was 210. 2009, it was actually a pretty clear year. It was less than 100, and for 2010, it was one wildfire went to 600. So the scale is a lot different. So, but the actual highest impact day was in February of 2010, and we did a back trajectory for that particular day. And as you can see, that the source of those NOx emissions were not from Wyoming at all, or from the area in southeast Wyoming where the Laramie River Station is. And we did this in our written comments. We did about 30 or 40 of those on the 30 or 40 highest days. Here's a distribution that shows a cross-section of all those days over a 10-year period, and the nitrate impact again is lowest in the summer when you average it over all the 10-year period, and the visitor at Wind Cave, as it is at Grand Teton Park or any national park, most of the visitations in the summer. This park is no different. And the impact, again, is from the nitrate is not happening when there's visitor visitation. On the, so that's just gives you a background on the modeling flaws with what EPA did. On the cost analysis that they did, they did not follow their own manual or their own rules. And the manual itself and the regulations say that you're supposed to develop costs taking into account the site-specific design and other conditions that affect the cost of a particular BART technology option. And that's what we did in our reanalysis. Now, when we did this in 2006, we were not responding to any other presentation. We did it based on what EPA had represented the cost numbers were going to be in terms of what was an unacceptable cost. If you look at the 2005-2006 regulation, they said anything that cost over $1,350 per ton was going to be deemed too expensive. Then for the, I'm going to flip through here quickly, but here's the Google Earth satellite photo that they used. And the fundamental problem with using a Google Earth satellite is that it doesn't take into account on the one side, the duct work, the increased structural support, and increasing SER capital costs. And this was a back, when it was constructed in the late 70s, early 80s, it was constructed to have back controls. So it already has technology at the back end, so all of that would have to be changed and structurally changed to allow us to fit in an SER, which is what makes, when you do a more detailed site-specific analysis, which makes the cost so much higher. So when we looked at all those factors in more detail than we did in our 2006 analysis in response to the Andover study, you can see here the cost per unit's about $250 million, or about $750 million total, and the cost, and compared to about under the Andover study, which basically didn't consider any of those site-specific factors and did not look at things related to the amount of airflow and things that are required at altitude and several other important factors, the cost of labor for construction in Wyoming compared to the national average, a whole bunch of things like that. You can see about a $420 million difference between the two cost studies that were most recently done. And that translates on an annual basis in cost of about $25 million in capital costs per year per unit, and about $5 million in operating O&M costs per unit. So it's about $30 million per unit, and our total, that would be about a third increase in cost of production from these facilities for our customers. Because our current cost of production is about $270 million per year. So that it would increase the cost of production by about 1/3 for a visibility benefit that cannot be seen. And that's essentially what our comments said.
Bryce and my fellow panelists. I'm from Iowa, the place where we grow the corn that was talked about in the previous session. I've spent a lot of time in Wyoming over the past several years working on this issue, and I can tell you that, you know, compared to Iowa, the views here are fabulous. We don't build houses to maximize a view. The maximum viewpoint is going to be a street or a cornfield or a soybean field maybe. So when I come here, it literally takes my breath away. And frankly, it's also why I feel very strongly about this issue relative to what EPA is proposing for purposes of the FIP. I work for and help support other organizations, but as MidAmerican Energy Holdings company, we have a number of operating companies around the United States. PacifiCorp is one of those. And I'm sort of like the firefighting brigade who comes in on sort of an as-needed basis to help out. And I think the bulk of my time, certainly over the last couple of years, has been spent on this issue. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't like spending money for nothing, right? And the company's money is, I treat like my money. And I don't like to spend it to get nothing in return. And I think that's really what the key concern here is we all believe that it's important to, you know, minimize our environmental footprint. We think it's a good thing to reduce emissions where it's prudent and reasonable to do so within the boundaries of the law. But in this circumstance and in this program, and what EPA is doing is really giving you nothing for a lot of money that's going to be spent. The first slide I've got here, I think we've really covered with one exception, and that's the second bullet. And EPA itself, and I'm going to come back to this point toward the end, EPA itself says Wyoming has some of the cleanest, best visibility in the country. Remember that as we go through this. And I don't know about you, but all that technical stuff, keep that in mind. Our company's position. We are not against emission reductions. In fact, as Bill talked to you about earlier, we've been engaged in making significant emission reductions for a long time. If we were opposed to it, we would have been litigating this. But no, we felt it was more appropriate to spend the dollars on actually making a difference in the emissions, improving the visibility. But I think we've gotten to the point where moving forward, we won't see a difference from those dollars spent. As a result, what's really objectionable is, again, we're not objecting to EPA's actions in as much as how they came about imposing those actions. And as I said, we don't oppose making prudent investments to reduce emissions where they're appropriate and where they're required by governmental agencies. We already maintain a diversified generation portfolio. Coal is not all we have, though some would like to think that. But it is an important part of our portfolio. It's certainly the backbone of our baseload generation portfolio. But we have natural gas facilities, we have wind facilities, we have hydro facilities, we've got geothermal. We do maintain a diversified portfolio. So that's not what this is about. It's not about us trying to protect coal, but to do the right thing under the law. So, key concerns about EPA's proposed action. I think we've also covered these for the most part. And it really boils down to the third bullet there, which is we don't believe that EPA followed the rules. When you're out there driving your vehicle and you got a four-way stop, The presumption is everybody's going to stop at the stop sign, right? You look to your right, you look to your left, and then you proceed forward. Here, same kind of thing applies, where the state went through its 5-factor analysis, it looked to the right, it looked to the left, it checked all the boxes, it was ready to proceed forward, and in fact did proceed forward with its plan. The problem is EPA blew through the stop sign, didn't care about what we've already done, and now is kind of looking in its rearview mirror saying, ha, we got you. That's problematic. And when it comes down to imposing some of these new controls, Bill talked earlier about new levels of controls that are required at some of the smaller units. The Dave Johnston 1 and 2, the Naughton 1 and 2, some of those units that are already kind of slated to see the end of their depreciable lives, when you start to shorten that lifespan from the presumptive 20 years down to 7 years or 11 years or whatever the situation is, it changes the economics dramatically. And that's where EPA really messed up. Now, I told you I was in Iowa, in the middle of the country, and I looked to the east and the west instead of the right and the left, maybe in my stop sign analogy. And I look at what's going on in the east, and certainly the eastern half of the United States has been embroiled in air quality issues for as long as I can remember. And one of the more recent rulemakings has been this transport rule, and it's been promulgated under a variety of names, but generically called the transport rule. At one point it was the Clean Air Interstate Rule, then it was the Cross-State Air Pollution Rule. Now we're not really sure what it is because a new rule hasn't come out, but the courts keep determining that EPA hasn't properly established that rule, whatever it may ultimately be, but we've got to comply with it in the interim anyway. But what's really tragic about that situation as compared to this is in the East, that transport rule is really designed to address health-based issues. Again, here, that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with what you see when you look outside and how far can you see it. And it's a little bit like, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody hears it, then what, right? When we look at the East, the cost effectiveness, as they were coming up with that transport rule, for nitrogen oxide emissions, they established the cost effectiveness criteria at $500 a ton and said, we believe it's reasonable for emission sources to make emission reductions if they're $500 a ton or less. Again, health-based standards. These are standards that, according to EPA, are impacting people's health, contributing to asthma, etc. In the West, well, somehow, to improve visibility, we can justify $6,000 a ton. Makes sense to you, right? Yeah, not so much. The transport rule allows emission trading. So rather than going unit by unit by unit and making each of those units, as they have in the West, reduce their emissions, in the East, they get to trade. Well, we all know bad outcomes of trading stories, right? Whether it's on Wall Street or elsewhere. Sometimes trading doesn't lead to optimum results. But nonetheless, they're not held to the same criteria as we're seeing in the West. Likewise, in the East, selective catalytic reduction, the SCR controls that Lyle and Bill talked about, is not required at not a single power plant in the eastern United States under the transport rule. Why? Because they can make their emission reductions by trading. And so they can over-control at one, not control at another, and it's okay, because it all comes out in the wash, right? But they do have visibility requirements, and somehow they're able to meet those visibility requirements in this trading program. And interestingly, EPA, when it tried to reach its conclusion that the transport rule was better than BART, this Western BART issue, it utilized what's called presumptive BART, which is not having SCR on every power plant, not having NCR on every power plant, but meeting a specific emission rate. And so the standards seem to be a little bit different. I guess we value visibility more than we value human health. At least that's the way the regulations are shaking out. And I'm going to go back to this issue of Wyoming having some of the best air in the country. The map on the left is EPA's map. I didn't create it. I'm not capable of creating such a map. But I think it's really important to look at that because, again, where are all the red spots? They're not in Wyoming, and they're not in Utah, and they're not anywhere close to here. They're all in the east. And as Bill and I were preparing for this presentation, we're talking about some of our favorite childhood games. Bill's happened to be Break the Ice. Mine, Tip It. And as you see on the box cover, and I think it's particularly applicable here, this is the wackiest balancing game ever. This whole issue is really a crazy balancing game. And we're hopeful that we ultimately prevail on the right side of the issue. What's next? Well, the public comment period closed August 26th, so the docket is sort of closed from the perspective of receiving any additional information, at least we think so. EPA is currently required to issue its final rule under its consent decree with Wild Earth Guardians and others by November 21st. Now there's an appeal pending right now in the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals that involved the state of Oklahoma under similar circumstances, not identical, but similar, where EPA came in and rejected the state SIP. The 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, a 3-judge panel, ruled 2-1 against the state of Oklahoma. We are hopeful that that does not set precedent for what ultimately may come in the state of Wyoming. But that case is also on a petition for reconsideration en banc by the full 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. We, PacifiCorp, like the state of Wyoming and other states, asked for information from EPA relative to these discussions and what happened between 2012 and 13 to change its perspective in issuing a FIP and the levels of controls required under that FIP. We, like the state, got about 6 emails that told us nothing other than people were meeting. So we have a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit pending against EPA as well. And of course, we're anticipating that if this issue is not ultimately favorably resolved, that we will see, perhaps both on the part of the state and the companies, administrative appeals as well as litigation. Now, I believe we're ready for some questions if we have time.